Since this is the first time I'm speaking to you at this event, I want to just give you some prefatory remarks here. Let me just try to get you to appreciate the significance of this week. There's really nowhere in the world, to my knowledge, that you can get something like this where it really is a graduate level program in Austrian economics, or in this particular case, Rothbardian economics. That, for example, at New York University, where I went, Israel Kirzner was there at the time, and Mario Rizzo, they're big names in the Austrian school, and it was it was a highly ranked school, and you're getting a PhD in economics, so you might think that, oh, so you guys must have been up till late hours talking about capital theory, and no, I wasn't up till late hours, but I wasn't talking about capital theory. So there wasn't even a class in Austrian economics. It was just the weekly Austrian seminar that my dissertation happened to be in Austrian economics, and that's why I now work for these think tanks, and I'm not teaching. But there's nothing there that you could really get what you're getting here. And then even at George Mason, where you might think there's something like this. I mean, I didn't go to George Mason, so I don't know for sure. But my sense is there you get more like, wow, there's a lot of free market people here, and there's a lot of libertarian guys, and there's people like Pete Becky who know Austrian economics, and so if you take a class with him, you'll get it. But I don't think there's anything really like what you're going to get in this week. And so because of that, we really have to teach it as if this really is a serious seminar. In other words, this isn't just a fun thing, let's come to Auburn and, hey, we all like Rothbard and let's have a good time, that this is actually fairly serious. So that's the way I'm approaching this. For example, I'm going to assume that all of you have read every word of this. I don't know if that's true or not. Don't tell me. But I know some of you have, just looking at the questions that you guys wrote up, or the comments. So I know some of you really have read this. And if you haven't, I would strongly suggest that, now there's plenty of time built in at night. There's not, instead of going down and getting drunk down the street, you can read this stuff and it'd be much better for you. So that's where I'm coming from. And like I said, I'm going to have to teach as if, because I know some of you have read that, because this is really the only opportunity I'm going to get to talk to those people who have read this. And if we just try to talk and summarize in these lectures and say, okay, in case you haven't ever heard of indirect exchange from the Austrian approach, let me tell you about it. That's the kind of stuff we do at Mises University. So that's for kids. This is for adults. All right. So that's where I'm coming from. And again, I mean, just to illustrate why that's so important, that when I go to Mises University and all these guys fly in here, I'm actually nervous. I think, like, what would happen if a tornado hit the Mises Institute and we all died? And what would happen to Rothbardian economics? That would be a serious crippling blow. And then as the Sunday when people are going back and I don't hear about any accidents from the Express 85 shuttle, I start relaxing and I don't read about any, there's no plane crashes, and I kind of calm down. First of all, Peter Klein owes me money, and so if his plane went down, But see, anyway, and I'm being serious. Like of course, you can tell by my hairline, I worry about a lot of stuff. But the point really is, though, that I mean there is this body of thought, and it's a lot safer now. We're more diversified. It wouldn't be, whereas like they were saying before, if Murray Rothbard, if a bus had hit him or something, there wouldn't be Austrian economics as we know it surviving. So the point is just we have to pass this along. And this is really the only time to do it at this level. And so that's why I'm going to be assuming that you guys have read this, even though maybe some of you haven't read every single word in this book. I'm going to have to talk to the people who have done that, because this is one of the rare chances we get. Okay, let me also just talk, the things I'm going to be talking about this week primarily concern monetary and capital theory, and then that includes the business cycle, because you really need to know the Austrian view of money and capital to understand the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And those are two areas where, just hands down, the Austrian theory is just unambiguously better than mainstream economics. Okay, there's other areas where I can at least understand why a mainstream economist would be real haughty and look down on the Austrians, like, you guys are just using primitive techniques, and come on, why don't you start using some more modern approaches? And for certain very technical questions, certain real subtle things where you really have to balance, and it's a quantitative matter, and how much of this factor versus this, but are you being consistent in your thought process? I can see where formal modeling is useful, and I certainly understand why the people who teach that at the big universities, why they think that their method is better than our method. But when it comes to monetary and capital theory, like I say, it's not even close. And just to sort of illustrate that, why this isn't just a, it's not like we have different schools of art appreciation, and we like this school and these other people like this type of painting. This is really significant that the recent mess that's going on with the economy, with the housing crisis and then the related credit crunch and so forth, that stuff, regular mainstream economists, even free market ones in particular, they didn't see that coming at all. That I know lots of supply-siders and they're very good economists. I'm not saying they're bad economists, but with the tools they use, the way they would just look out at the world and try to see what's going on and then give advice to other people who turn to them because they're really good economists, they, as of even 18 months ago, were saying, no, yeah, there's a little bump here and there, but no, things should be fine. And why? Well, Bush cut taxes. Say, well, what about monetary policy? And they would look and say, no, inflation for the last 5-10 years, it was a lot better than it was in the early 80s or the late 70s. So what are you talking about? Monetary policy hasn't been bad. And, in terms of free trade, we don't have free trade, but tariff barriers are a lot lower the last 10 years than they were historically. So on all those different areas, the free market economists could plausibly argue that things should be great right now, and obviously they're not. And what that person was missing is they don't understand the Austrian business cycle theory. So, if nothing else, by the end of this week, I want to get across to you how knowledge of the Austrian business cycle theory really would have equipped you to understand that, because it happened with me that when I was working for a financial firm, and I didn't see all this stuff coming. And then I did a consulting project for a bank, and I just started looking at this stuff with fresh eyes, because now I wasn't doing what my boss wanted me to do, but I was, on my own, because I was doing the analysis myself, so it wasn't going to have somebody else's name on it. So I was just looking at it with fresh eyes, and the stuff just jumped out at me. And maybe in some of my later talks this week, I'll show you the things I saw. So again, it's not that Austrian economics is a predictive. It's not correct because it predicts well. That's not the basis of its validity. But it can't hurt you to have a correct theory in hand when you go out and look at the world. And like I say, this was a case where it was just so obvious that the economy was on the brink of serious trouble. And like I said, that really was a case where the Austrian economics informed me, and the other supply side free market economics just completely missed the warning signals. All right, so as far as this chapter goes, let me just briefly mention that, and I mentioned this in the study guide, a lot of economists, they use the terms barter and indirect, they mean one thing by barter, they mean that there's not money, and Rothbard is using the terms interchangeably, barter and indirect exchange, and actually there's a slight difference, so I just want to point that out to you. It's not that what Rothbard's saying is wrong, but just be careful that here when Rothbard is talking about indirect exchange, that could include a scenario where there isn't yet a money, and yet there is indirect exchange. All right. Whereas if you're using the term barter to mean just a community where there's no money, then that's a broader definition. And as we'll see, it really is surprisingly, it's almost nonsensical to try to think through the logical consequences of what if you really just restricted it to direct exchange. That's actually extremely limited, as we'll see, that it just almost, naturally, indirect exchange has to emerge. And so the example that Rothbard talks about, and that I elaborate a little bit on in the study guide, is if you had indirect exchange, and again, just to reemphasize, what does that mean? It's where you are exchanging in order to get something that you don't plan on using, and it's not just for consumption, but you don't plan on using it in production either. Okay, so you can have direct exchange where you're getting something that you don't intend to consume, but that you're getting a producer good that you want to use yourself in some process of production. All right, so that also could be a case of direct exchange. And indirect exchange, obviously, is when the thing that you're trading away for is something that you're neither going to consume nor use in production. And as I say, that's extremely limited if you're going to rule out indirect exchange. You can't. The standard stuff you'll hear about when you take any economics class and they talk about what are the advantages of money. You'll hear stuff that, how could specialization occur? Because the dentist would have to find somebody who needed his tooth pulled and then had the exact things that the dentist wanted to buy that day. And, what are the chances of those two things overlapping? And so you hear stories like that, but outside of Rothbard, I've never seen someone really delve into just exactly how important money is, or indirect exchange is, because it's a lot more than just that type of example. It's a lot more than just specialization, that just advanced production in and of itself really couldn't happen without indirect exchange. And one of you asked a question about that, so let me just make sure you see why. So you couldn't, or it would be very difficult if you wanted to build a house for you to hire other people to come and work on it without engaging in indirect exchange, because you would have to have all of the things that you were going to pay them with just on hand. You'd have to happen to have a bunch of food lying around, or a bunch of soft drinks, or whatever it is that these workers wanted in exchange for their labor, or the people who own the lumber that you needed for your house. You would just have to have exactly what you wanted, because the reason I say you would have to just happen to have that on you is because you couldn't say, okay, you know what, next week I want to build a house and I'm going to need some workers, so I better go out in the market and get a bunch of steak and rice to give them so they can work on my house, because in that case you would be engaging in indirect exchange when you went out and got the steak, because you would be getting the steak not because you wanted to use it, and not even because you wanted to use it to build your house, but because you wanted to give it to somebody else for their labor. Okay, so that would, the prohibition on indirect exchange would prevent you from doing that. So that's the reason that if you really think through, it would be hard to do almost anything if you are outlawing indirect exchange. And so that's why it's a lot more than simply you wouldn't have specialization in different professions, that it's a lot more restrictive than that. And then, of course, the whole notion of economic calculation, you need money in order to do that. And that's, again, something that the Austrians recognize a lot more than other schools of thought would. Now, as Rothbard points out, the definition of indirect exchange, the distinction between direct and indirect exchange, is pretty crisp, but the borderline between, well, what happens if something is a medium of exchange, and then where do you draw the line between that and a money? That's not crisp, because all money is a medium of exchange that is commonly accepted. And so there's no crisp definition. And even right now, like, we're all sure, even though we don't think it's a good form of money, like a $20 bill in your pocket, that's money. It's commonly accepted around here. But I mean, there could be some guy out in the hills that you go to his house and you want to give him Federal Reserve notes for something, and he points a shotgun at you and says, "Get out of here with that. I don't take paper money." And he probably contributes to this institution, that kind of guy. But you see that, so there you can say, oh well, there was one person there who didn't want to accept this thing. And so I guess this isn't money. And you'd say, well, no, I mean, it's commonly accepted. And so the green pieces of paper, unfortunately, would count as money right now. And so by the same token, if you're looking at a free market society, it's not necessary that every single person in the whole community accepts gold or silver in order for those to count as money. It's just a sort of vague, it's commonly accepted. All right, so that's what Rothbard's getting at there, that distinction. Whereas it is crystal clear is something direct or indirect. Now, as an outside observer, you might not know that. You would need to know what the person's motivations were. But the point is, if the person who's acquiring something in exchange is going to use it for consumption or production personally, then it's direct exchange. Otherwise, it's indirect. Let me talk a little bit about Menger's theory of the origin of money. So I think the next chapter talks about the regression theorem, so I'm not going to talk about that. But let me just reiterate again what Menger's explanation for the origin of money is. So first of all, it's a strange type of theory. So what Menger says is that goods have different, he called saleability, and Rothbard used the term marketability. And this is even before money emerges. When you just have direct exchange, that is the case, that some goods you have more people willing to accept them because those people happen to need it more. There are some things that not very many people are going to use for consumption or production, and so they have a very limited market. So they're not very marketable. And then over time, so people recognize that, and then once they realize that, okay, I have something very unmarketable that I want to unload, and what do? Well, one way of achieving my end is to trade it away for something that I don't actually want, but that's more marketable than the thing I got rid of, and then that allows me to ultimately achieve my objective. And so that process, you just think through what would happen. Well, then obviously that would just amplify the superior marketability of the things that initially were more marketable, because more and more people would accept them in indirect exchange. And it's just a snowball process until Menger says that a few things just outstripped all others, And, and once it reaches the point where virtually everyone, or it's commonly accepted, then that medium of exchange becomes a money. So that's, as I say, I don't really know how to talk about that. It's an interesting, it's not that Menger went and did historical research and saw someone's diary where that person pointed out, oh, this is how money emerged in this year. Isn't that neat? So that's not the way Menger derived that, but yet at the same time, you're pretty sure he's basically onto the right story, that it had to be something along those lines. And what he did in particular was he critiqued the state theory of money, which, as you might expect, it seemed very natural. People to say, well, where did money come from? We know what money is beneficial, so there must have been some smart person thousands of years ago that said, this is pretty dumb that we just engage in direct exchange, or that there's no commonly accepted unit of account and all these things that money does for us, or this new concept. So wouldn't it be great if we all just traded our goods against this one thing, and then look at all the advantages that would flow from that? And so maybe a king thought of it, or maybe someone smart person told the king, and the king put out the decree. And there's a lot of problems with that. So one thing is there's no record of that happening. You would think, we know, or we think we know people who have discovered certain trigonometry results and things like that. And, smart people throughout history who came up with brilliant ideas, we have an idea, or there are records of those things happening. You would think if somebody invented money, we might know who that person was. This guy was joking to me one time. He said, well, wasn't it John Money? But no, it wasn't John Money. And so it is, so that's sort of odd. And then, if you push it further though, how would anyone ever even come up with that idea if you didn't know what money was? Like, it's really, if you just stop and try to think about what money is, it's a very odd thing. And it's actually a lot easier to see how weird it is now when we have fiat money, that you try to get your students to say, well, why is it that you go and work all day at the factory in order for these pictures of paper with presidents' portraits on them? And whereas if you say, why do you work all day for these bars of gold? They might say, well, why wouldn't I work for bars of gold? That's a great idea. So it's actually a little bit easier to get people to see how strange it is that we trade things for money when it's fiat money. And so the point is, can you imagine somebody before people recognized its advantages, if someone just started talking about that, and how about we all just, let's take these seashells, and how about you give me your house and your cows, and I'll give you 2,000 of these, but don't worry, because the guy down the street, he'll give you his telescope if you give those shells to him. So go ahead and give me your house, and I'll give you these shells. And, people would just say, what, are you crazy? And so the point is, you can't just force it, that if people don't accept something as a medium of exchange or as a money, you really couldn't force it. And even if you tried, you could say, well, no, maybe there was a king that just, at the threat of sword point made people do that. You'd run into the problem, well, what prices should he set? Because it wouldn't be enough just to say, okay, from now on, shells are an acceptable payment, because then the guy with the house that the other person wants to take his house in exchange for shells could say, okay, the price is 18 billion shells. And so you can see that it's not enough just to say, okay, now I'm a smart guy, I know about money, we're all going to start using it, or else you get shot, because then you have to put in prices, and so you would have to plan the whole economy. Another way of seeing it is if you're on a plane and it crashes in the mountains somewhere and you're isolated, presumably the people there aren't going to be trading the cash in their wallets for stuff, because they might say, well, we don't ever get rescued, I don't know. So they might not use those things as money anymore. And even though everyone's from modern civilization, they all realize, we really ought to have money, they couldn't just say, okay, well, let's make these leaves money. Or, what I'm saying? That even if they all knew the advantages of money, it would have to emerge along the lines of Menger's story. It might be quicker if they all knew what money was, but the point is you can't just pick something. So anyway, these are all reasons that Menger was giving as to why the standard theory of where money came from really wasn't a compelling story. Okay, let me move along. Another point I want to make sure we understand is, again, when you in a standard economics class, they're going to talk about things that make for a good money, and they'll talk about, it's divisible, it's durable, ease of transport, and those are all true, but they're not the definition of money. Okay, so the money is, or at least in the Austrian approach, the definition is it's a medium of exchange that is commonly accepted. And now if you want to understand historically why do gold and silver tend to be chosen as monies, at least in the modern period, it's for all those reasons I just said, that it's hard to use cattle because they could die on you, or it's hard to get them to go places. And whereas gold and silver, at the same time, platinum or other things, they might be a little bit too valuable, that It's, in terms of the types of exchanges you're going to be engaging in, gold and silver are just great on many different reasons, and there's nothing really wrong with them. Whereas everything else you might think of to use as money, it might be good in some respects, but there's really just one strike against it that kind of rules it out, whereas gold and silver, for the reasons I just mentioned, were really the best there was. But again, that's not, and so that's why Rothbard talks about gold, but just to be clear, it's not that money has to be gold if you're a libertarian or an Austrian. It's just that we think that's what the market would adopt if it weren't forced onto a different path. And so that's why sometimes we loosely talk about gold, and you might get the impression that, it's got to be gold. But no, it's whatever the market picks, but it historically picked gold for that reason. Okay, let me put up a couple things here from the book, just going through it. I want to point out a few things. Okay, so this equation up there, I mentioned it in the study guide. Of course, you understand what Rothbard's talking about there, but I think it's a little bit confusing to have the two nets in there. That if you just got rid of this last phrase, the net addition to cash balance, that would include both the inflows and the outflows. And so I think you could get rid of that. The other thing is this equation, and then later on when he's talking about exports and imports, he's not dealing with credit transactions. And I think he explicitly mentions that in this chapter, that we're not going to deal with credit, we'll deal with that later. And he does deal with it later, I think in the chapter Money and Its Purchasing Power. He explicitly talks about that. So I'm just warning you, be careful here. It's that word income that's a little bit dubious there, that really it would be more correct if he had here, money inflow or something, and you might say, what's the difference? Well, just because in accounting, if you go out and you take out a loan and you get $1 million, you're not going to call that income because you can't, you incurred a debt to get that. So it's certainly cash flow flowing in that you have control over now, but it's not really income in the accounting sense. So anyway, but if you're not worried about credit transactions, then this is correct as it is. And as I say, Rothbard was aware of that, and he just deferred the discussion. And so the same thing with the exports and the imports. I'm not going to get into it right now because it's not really too relevant for this chapter, but the issue with, he talks about trade deficits, and really there's a distinction between a current account deficit versus a trade deficit. They're similar, but they're not the same thing. So late after the session, if you're up late at night saying what's the difference between current account deficit and a trade account deficit, I'll allow you to get your sleep, but I'm not going to put the rest of you to sleep right now talking about it. Another thing I want to mention here is, all right, so this this figure, this is, all these figures, they're all simplifications. I mean, this is ridiculously simplified. This isn't the economy. This isn't a picture of the economy. The point is just to isolate certain concepts in the text. And my point here is just to say that this is a lot better if you use this simplification than if you use the circular flow that you'll get in a mainstream textbook. All right, now you're not going to probably be able to read that because of the photocopying, but it's saying up here that consumption purchases flow from, the money from the public goes to businesses, and then in exchange for that, businesses give the public goods and services, and then the public gives their productive services to business in exchange for the business paying wages, interest, and profit to the public. And so this is the circular flow. And if you're just studying this is from Samuelson's textbook, and the point here is that if this is the way you're thinking about general equilibrium, if this is the way you view the economy, you're not going to understand the Austrian business cycle theory. You can't have a business cycle theory in here unless you do some aggregate underconsumption or overinvestment theory, that there's no structure, but there's no time lag in here. There's no way to show that there could be, that the Austrian story itself, you literally cannot put into this picture. Now, in fairness, actually, Samuelson, the chapter I took this from, later on he gets into the stuff. Samuelson actually he's a very worthy adversary, and so he does get into capital theory, but the point is, even more modern textbooks that sort of just crib from Samuelson's classic textbook, they grab this and they don't take the other because it's just too complicated for most mainstream economists. They don't worry about that. So and we'll talk about this later when I get into the other capital theory chapters later on. But it's true, for those of you who are in grad school, mainstream economics, their formal tools, you can do a lot with it. You can take a lot of the verbal stuff from here and translate it into a formal model if you want. And actually some of my own work, I have done that. But you wouldn't have known to do it if you didn't read it verbally, okay? That you wouldn't have stumbled across that possibility if you were just studying these models, because you're focused on finding equilibrium outcomes, and you're trying to say, oh, well, there's this new mathematical result. Is there a way I could use it? Oh, yeah, if we assume people's preferences are like this, we could apply this theorem, and that would be a neat result. And so just, like I say, it's not that it's impossible to see some of the Austrian insights in a formal model, but it's very difficult. And so that's why it's important. That's why I was saying in the beginning of this talk that we want to pass this on to make sure that there are people reading this book, that it's not enough just to, even read the study guide. The study guide is just sort of refreshing your memory, and you really need to read the original. And then, let me see, is there any other one? Okay, let me also, I'm going to go about 5 or 10 more minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, but let me talk about a couple of these questions. Somebody asked me, I think it wasn't clear from the question if it was supposed to be for this chapter, but let me just talk about this. Okay, so now I need to, Chad, if I do wide, that unzooms it? Okay. So somebody asked me to talk about consumer and producer surplus. So this is the standard way you do it in a mainstream book. So here's the demand curve, and the consumer surplus is the area above the price line and under the demand curve. And the idea is, and so the question was, how do you guys feel about that? Is this legitimate? I have mixed feelings. It really is neat how you can show some of the problems with government intervention with these diagrams. But it's probably a case of where you're using an invalid concept to make fun of the government. And so you want to be able to do it, but I'm not sure how I feel about this. Clearly, if someone used this to show the market was bad, I would say, this is a bunch of garbage. So probably it is a bunch of garbage, but let me show you why. So the theory is, where they're coming from with this thing, is they're going to say, look, here for each unit, like let's say this is the 10th unit, the height of the demand curve shows how much would people pay. At what price would people demand 10 units? And so, all right. So what that means now, we know, and this is again even in a mainstream undergrad class, they would say this, that we know that people value at least the first 9 units, as more than that or as much as that, and then the 10th unit, whatever this price is, if it's $10, and let's say this price is $4. And so the point is that, look, for each of these 10 units, people would have been willing to pay $10 for each of those, and yet they're only having to pay $4. And so there's a $6 surplus on each of those 10 units. And then you do that for each unit, and so you're summing up, this surplus, and so it's the area of that curve. What it's basically doing is showing you the benefits to the consumer from the existence of this market. All right, and so I like the idea of it, because it shows undergrads that it's not right to think, someone walks into a grocery store and buys $120 worth of stuff and gives away $120 worth of stuff, namely cash, and so both sides break even. That's a common way of thinking about it, but obviously no, that's not right. And so if you understand consumer surplus, that's one way to try to get it across. Or another way of saying is, what if I just took away the existence of this market? How does that hurt anybody? And you could say, well, because they're missing out on this surplus, that they would have been able to buy stuff at $4, and at least for these units, they valued them a lot more. Now, like I say, there's a couple problems with this. One thing is just on the face of it, it's adding up. It's trying to measure utility, and so we know that's not right. No matter what's going on here, if you think it's impossible to measure utility, and this is purporting to show that you can measure how happy a consumer is because of a market, it can't be valid. Specifically, another specific problem is it's not true that if you set the price at 10, well, you do know, yeah, people would have bought 10 units, but then you can't take the next step and say, okay, what if you wanted to get people to buy 15? Oh, we'd have to set the price at 7, and then people would have been willing to pay $7 for the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th, and 15 units. You don't know that because it's true that if the price is 7, they buy 15, but they have more money at that point than they would have had if you first set the price at 10 and they gave you $100. All right, so if you took $100 away from them and then lowered the price to 7, it's not clear that they would have bought 5 additional units. All right, but that's what's going on here. It's assuming that it makes sense to say someone values the first unit at $100 and the second unit at 87, and that you can sum up the valuations on all those units, and that's the total amount that the person would pay to get all those units, and that's not necessarily true. All right, so that's a specific sort of mechanical objection to what's going on there. So anyway, that would be my response. Oh, and the other one, of course, is that it relies on calculus a lot, the standard depiction, when that's not really correct. But then even there, you could say, okay, well, what if we made it discrete? Could you add up the amounts? And again, I don't think it makes sense that what you're doing is, first of all, not true that you could. It's not true the consumer would pay this plus this plus this on all these units. You don't know that. The demand curve doesn't give you that information. And then it's also what you think you're getting and then adding them together. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, and then let me turn to another question. Somebody said, that, let's see here. Okay, he's referring to the marketability. I was trying to clarify that to say something's not marketable or it has a low salability, it's not the same thing as saying it's not valuable. In fact, there could be things that are quite valuable, but they're not marketable. So you can own a house, but it's not very marketable. And so it means, what I think it means is that how long do you have to spend trying to find what Menger called an economic price? And so, as opposed to a $20 bill is extremely marketable, that what you're likely to get for it, you can go out and get very quickly. In other words, you don't have to spend months looking for the best buyer for it, whereas if you're selling a piece of art, you're selling an antique, you're going to do a thorough search for the right buyer. Okay, so that's what I meant there. So someone, in response to that, said, it is noted that anything can be sold given a low enough price. And then he asked, how do you sell ice to a penguin? Okay, so first of all, you're right. I mean, I had in mind if there's human buyers or rational actors, if the penguin, I don't know, has needs, or is an actor, then maybe the penguin would. But the real answer there is, okay, I mean, you're right, I probably didn't have this in mind, but technically you could lower the price to make it negative. So you could pay someone to take the thing off your hand. So, virtually for anything you can think of, you could unload it very quickly if you're willing to lower the price, and even if you make the price negative.